I'd had resonated with this negotiator from the SDIC. His first response, the first words that came out of his mouth, he called me Su Tongzhi, which translates as Comrade Su. He viewed me, because of what I said and how I said it, as on the same level of him.
How can a chance encounter in high school lead to you negotiating trade deals with China? Former Assistant Secretary to the Treasury for International Markets, Mitchell Silk is with me today to discuss his latest book, A Seat at the Table, in which he goes through just that. In this video, we're going to talk more about your book specifically. Let's start with the first story in it, which you told me about yesterday, but we can go into a bit more detail with it. You met two friends at high school who were from Hong Kong, and you ended up working in the restaurant. Can you tell us how that started?
It's the beginning of a string of events that I like to put together with one thread that runs through them, which I view as a thread of hashgacha, a thread of divine providence. My friendship and acquaintance with this particular family was really the turning, a very fundamental and kind of cornerstone turning point in my life, which really defined my whole professional career, and ultimately led to my being asked to join the Treasury Department in Trump 45. And it came about in an interesting and pretty simple way. I was born and grew up in Chicago in a very, homogeneous Jewish suburb, just about a mile or mile and a half out of the, to the north and west of the core of the Orthodox Jewish community. A lot of families started to move into Skokie and Morton Grove because of affordability in the early 60s. And my family moved to Florida right around my bar mitzvah. And I found myself in a rather interesting predicament right after my bar mitzvah, because my parents divorced. I was living along with my two sisters with my mother, and for a variety of reasons, she was carrying the burden of the household. And I felt that it was important for me to chip in and kind of carry my weight a little bit and provide a little bit of financial support and help me save up money for a car and some tuition. And so in my first or second year of high school, a family moved into our neighborhood literally across the street from us from Hong Kong. There were 5 kids, 3 of whom were boys in my immediate age group. And I helped them out in getting acclimated to the United States. One of them spoke okay English and the other 2 not so great. And I helped them a lot. And I ultimately was asked to take a job in their family's restaurant, which was just a couple blocks away from the house. And I started out as a dishwasher, really hot in unair-conditioned kitchens in South Florida in the summer, as well as most parts of the year. My job was to clean off bus pans of dishes, rinse them, put them through the dishwasher, and stack them. I later got a minor promotion to help with food prep, to cut 100-pound sacks of onions and cabbage. And then later I was promoted to busboy, and ultimately I became a waiter and kind of head of the house, which I did for about 3 or 4 years, which provided a nice little parnusa, nice little livelihood that allowed me to save up to pay for my college tuition. But it was really complete hashgacha in my view.
And did you, before this, had you interacted with people from, I want to say China, but they're from Hong Kong, right? So anyone from East Asia, this sort of culture before?
I in Chicago, where we lived, there was a growing Asian population. You kind of see that all over the United States. We live in Borough Park now, and we are surrounded by Chinese on the north and south edges of, on the east and west edges of our neighborhood. A lot of Koreans started to move into our area when I was younger. And, that combined with Bruce Lee, the television series, I just had I felt that there was an interesting mystique to Asian culture. And so it was kind of a combination of the two that drew me to Asia generally, the wanting to help this family, and particularly the couple of young men that I became friendly with, that was more an act that I felt was very appropriate, that we should help others. It's a part of our DNA, right?
Yeah, I honestly, that story really resonates. The idea of that you meet friends in high school, and just through that simple act of wanting to help your friends run their restaurant and integrate into the country, you end up actually being able to create your whole career out of it. Is very much providence. I don't have a better word for it.
And the relationship with them led to my being led to my mastering Chinese. I started work at the restaurant in the back of the house. I didn't really have a need to know Chinese, but when I started to work in the front of the house, and particularly needed to interact with the cooks, none of whom spoke English, I felt it was imperative that I needed to master the lingo in order to get my food out of the kitchen, so that I could do a good job at waiting tables and ultimately make good tips.
And it was Cantonese you learned at the restaurant,
Yeah,
right?
much to my, I had no understanding at the time that there were 8 major dialects in China. I completely did not know that Cantonese was the dialect spoken in only the southeastern province of Guangdong, which represents roughly 5% of the population in China. But at the time represented, the Cantonese speakers in America represented about 95 or 6% of the Chinese in America. So very prevalent dialect in the US, not so prevalent in China. And it was for that reason that about 6 years into it, after I was feeling pretty good about having mastered Chinese, that I learned, much to my chagrin, that I did not speak the main dialect of Chinese. And so if I wanted to have a career in China, I really needed to learn Mandarin. And so that triggered my going to Middlebury College in the summer of 1979 to do one of their 11 different languages. I chose Mandarin Chinese as the intensive program that I would attend, which is a 9-week program that they still offer. You end up getting 15 college credits, which is the equivalent of a year's worth of study. And I came out of that program not quite fluent, but had a very solid foundation. And the director of the program suggested that I go to Taiwan to study to perfect my Mandarin, which I did for a year.
So that's where my next question is. Did anyone in Taiwan find it a bit odd that a foreigner spoke Cantonese? Was there any sort of a reaction to them thinking, why do you speak Cantonese? I mean, it would be a bit like learning Arabic and then only learning the Yemeni dialect or something.
Yeah, I mean, it was a long time ago. I'm thinking back, kind of running through the computer files as we're talking, and I think the answer would probably be not so much. I'm sure that I'm absolutely sure that there were some that found it very interesting, because there were not that many foreigners that spoke Chinese, whatever dialect at the time. But interestingly, Taiwan has a very strong representation of the Mormon Church, and the Mormons send out a lot of students to work for the church and to try to bring people into the Mormon fold. They have at Brigham Young and other places in the United States and elsewhere a lot of really solid language training institutes. They teach more than a couple of dialects because they have folks that go to Hong Kong, that go to Cantonese-speaking countries or more prevalent Cantonese-speaking countries. And in addition, a lot of their the folks, the Mormons that were in Taiwan, actually spoke the local Taiwan dialect, which is one of the 3 dialects from the Fujian province, Hokkien. So kind of when you have white guys that speak Hokkien, right?
Yeah, they're not going to be so impressed when you speak a different.
It was a deal, but like not such a big deal.
Oh, interesting. So I know that after you study in Taiwan, you come back to the States. You do your law undergrad. And then you also, do you teach or do you also learn at Peking, Beijing University?
Yeah, so the progression was that I came back to the States. My high school professor, one of my high school teachers, Ed Foley, recommended that with my background, I should really go to Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. to build up a solid, set of skills in international relations that would suit me well for a professional school of my choice. So I did that for 2 years. My Chinese, when I got back from Taiwan, was at a level that there were really no undergrad courses for me. So undergrad Chinese courses. So I ended up taking one of the graduate courses that Georgetown offered. Georgetown, of course, has a very solid language and linguistics program. But I actually taught first year and third year Chinese when I was studying it for my bachelor's degree. And then from there, I went to Maryland Law School. Little bit of an odd choice, which is a thread also that runs through a lot of my background, kind of a little bit of oddity, as I like to say with a smirk. But at the time, there was one kind of hotbed and center of Chinese legal studies in the United States, which was at Harvard. The founder of that program, a fellow named Jerry Cohen, at the time that I was applying to law school, had taken sabbatical from Harvard and was practicing law in Hong Kong. And his junior professor, the person that was junior to him at the Harvard East Asian Legal Studies program, ended up leaving Harvard and getting a tenured professor position at Maryland. And so he set up what became to be really the leading East Asian Legal Studies program in the United States at the time. There were only two other law schools that offered courses in Chinese law when I was a law student. One of them was Columbia, a program ran by a fellow named Randy Edwards, who specialized in Qing Dynasty law. And I felt that probably was not so helpful to, kind of modern business and commerce. And there was another fellow, Bill Alford at WashU in St. Louis, and I felt that all things being equal, probably Maryland with Professor Cho was the best place for me. And it turned out to be correct because Professor Cho afforded me a lot of great opportunities to speak and to do research and to write and publish in the area to establish my name. His father was a very well-known legislator in Taiwan. He himself became a cabinet member just after I graduated. And so that provided me with a lot of further high-level contacts in Taiwan, and also opened the door for me to go and study on a U.S. government fellowship in Beijing after I finished my Juris Doctor at Maryland.
So you mentioned something interesting in the book. I'm guessing it's happening while you're in Beijing. You go to Shenzhen, right? And anyone who thinks of Shenzhen today will think of this big high-tech manufacturing city. But my guess is you were there before it was anything like that, right? If you're talking back in the 80s.
Rice fields.
Wow.
The first time that I went to Shenzhen was in the mid-'70s, and it was rice fields. It was just rice fields. A friend of mine came from there. We went to visit his ancestral town, and there was nothing there. I went back in 86, 87 when I was on my fellowship, and I actually did a course at Shenzhen University in the Department of Law, which had just been formed a couple of years prior. And only at that time did a few buildings start to appear. Certainly nothing like you see today.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the contrasting pictures. It's a bit like the pictures of Dubai in the 70s versus Dubai today, but it's even more stark because you realize, oh wow, this isn't even oil money. This is the government basically built this giant city there. How when you've gone back today, have you felt has any of it been recognizable to you, or is it just completely different?
It's completely different.
That's going to be an interesting feeling, actually,
Yeah.
to be able to go somewhere and say, like, they've completely changed the entire place.
Well, it's a statement of the robust growth that China has witnessed, particularly in Southeast China.
For sure. Let's talk about a little bit the Phase 1 deal and your negotiations during it. There's, just as a testament to perhaps how good your Chinese is. So could you tell us a little bit about this anecdote and maybe why this was so important for the negotiations?
Yeah, I'll give you, you refer to the Phase 1 trade negotiations.
Yes.
There was an interest. I told two stories that relate to my use of my fluency in Chinese at the negotiating table. One of the reasons why we called the book A Seat at the Table. One of them occurred prior to my going into government, when I had first, it was probably the first major power deal of tens of very large power deals that I did in China. It was a power project in Gansu province, which is in very far to the northwest of China. It takes 5 hours to fly there from Hong Kong, just to give you an idea of the expanse of the country. And we had been negotiating that deal for the better part of a year, focused on the project documents, mainly the offtake and the construction agreements. And originally, our main counterpart was the Gansu provincial government through their power bureau and their power construction company. And when we had gotten about 70 or 80% of the way through the issues in the negotiations, the central government did a reorganization countrywide of the whole of the power sector. And one of the state development companies directly under the Politburo became a shareholder, a stakeholder in all of the major power companies throughout China. Mm-hmm. And so we ended up with a new party at the table. In addition to the Gansu provincial party bureaucrats, we also got a very, very senior central government party bureaucrat who was sitting at the negotiation table. So a political negotiating $1 billion power project and a very complex cross-border multi-currency financing, right?
But that's sort of par for the course for China.
In instances, yes. There are a lot of like really savvy folks these days, and even later in the time that I spent in China. But at this particular juncture, in this particular negotiation, the entry of this new participant, the State Development Investment Corporation, put a real wrench in the works, as it were. All decision making, even on the most commercial of issues, became highly politicized. And it took some months. I kind of made progress in developing a relationship slowly with the members of the SDIC negotiating team. The leader of the team was a gentleman who was very senior in the party. He did not participate in every negotiation, but in this particular negotiation, when we were at a very significant milestone, like a real turning point in the deal, he appeared as the senior negotiator on their side. Mm-hmm. And those negotiations, that round of negotiations took place actually in Shenzhen, even though the deal was in northwestern China. And I was not able to participate in the beginning of that meeting because I was double booked on another negotiation. So I missed the first morning, arrived in Shenzhen midday, and came to the table just after lunch.
Okay.
And my colleagues, including the senior partner that led our office at the time, I could see were struggling with this guy. He was really giving them a run for their money, and we were not making any progress. Because I came in late, I was sitting on the back bench, not at the table, because other lawyers had been leading in my absence. And it got to a point where I was following the Chinese. The two lead negotiators from our side were English speakers. And it got to a point where I just kind of stood up and butt in Chinese. And I feel, and you'll learn why in just a second, that I'd had resonated with this negotiator from the SDIC, and he was inclined to agree with me, but certainly was having a difficult time in doing so. And why do I say that? Because his first response, the first words that came out of his mouth were to address me. But he didn't address me by calling me my normal Chinese name, Su Qi. He didn't call me Mr. Silk. He didn't call me Qi Ge, which would have been a diminutive version, of close friends. He called me Su Tongzhi, which translates as Comrade Su. In other words, that he viewed me because of what I said and how I said it as on the same level of him.
Wow.
And immediately after he uttered those three words, Su Tongzhi, he kind of stopped and pulled back in his seat, turned to his right and turned to his left. And you could tell that he was saying, did I call this guy Comrade Su just now? And the whole room burst into laughter. But
That's honestly that's a really good anecdote from negotiations, because
yeah,
it shows you how much you really do end up
yeah,
getting caught up in the back and forth.
yeah. But the other anecdote that you were referring to at the Phase One trade negotiations was of a similar type, and probably even it was certainly much more dramatic and much higher stakes. So we had it came time finally after weeks of preparation to travel to China and attend the first round of what became the Phase One trade agreement with China. We'd spent a ton of time planning and drafting up preparing the draft in English and Chinese, sent it over. We took a flight over. I was with Secretary Mnuchin, my secretary, who led the delegation. We were with the USTR Ambassador Lighthizer. We were with Larry Kudlow, head of the NEC. We were with Wilbur Ross, who was then Secretary of Commerce, and many more senior officials. We got to Beijing, we landed, we went to the embassy for a huddle. We had learned that the Chinese had delivered a draft that they wanted to use, completely like not paying any attention to our draft, and gave it to us only in Chinese, which was their first attempt at having a go at us, like to try to shake us up. We met, we formulated a position, a very simple position on that particular issue, which was that we weren't going to use their document. And our whole delegation swept through the streets of Beijing, which had been closed off as probably 40, 50 cars, black cars, just zooming down the main thoroughfare, which is unheard of in Beijing because of the traffic. We got to Diaoyutai, which is the state guest house where Mao had received foreign dignitaries and every leader of China since then, and we all like very very well orchestrated kind of Beijing political opera, kind of filed into the lobby, the opening antechamber to the negotiation room, and then we all made our way into the main negotiation room, and all protocol issues had been very carefully and painstakingly negotiated prior to the meeting, so that the 50 odd people on each side knew exactly where they were going to be sitting. They were seated according to protocol: first row, second row, third row, center, left of center, right of center. And we all got in there. There were tens of people from our delegation. And as everybody sat down and the meeting was about to begin, it became abundantly apparent that there was one chair missing from our side. So this poor fellow who was seatless, right, had to leave the room because they closed the doors and the official meeting started. It was a very dedicated career member of one of the agencies that attended on our side. And after weeks of preparation, he found himself kicked out of the room, no seat at the table,
Wow.
right? And so we were in for a good hour. We took a break. When I went out, I wanted to find out what the hell the story was with the chair after 3 weeks of protocol negotiations, right? Advance team prep, so on and so forth. And I saw the number 2 from our embassy, the DCM of the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, in a heated discussion with the head of the protocol department from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I asked what the story was. He said that our DCM said that the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs were refusing to give us a chair that they had agreed to, even though it had been negotiated over weeks. And the reason, we later learned, was because they felt slighted when their vice premier, who led the negotiations that day and led negotiations to Washington, Liu He, on his previous trip to Washington a couple of weeks prior, was denied a meeting with the president in the White House. So they felt snubbed, so they were going to snub us back. And I asked nicely in Chinese. I didn't want to escalate because I knew how that would end on Chinese manners. I asked more urgently. I asked in every which way that I felt was appropriate, and I kept on getting stonewalled by this protocol guy. As it turns out, the person that was then the head of the People's Bank of China, the central bank governor, a fellow named Yi Gang, who was a very close friend of ours at Treasury. We had a very close relationship with him, and just a couple weeks prior, on that visit from Liu He, we had hosted him at the Treasury Department. He happened to be walking by. Poor Governor E, because I called out to him and I said, Governor E, could you help us out with this little issue here? And I explained it to him, and he was going back and forth with the protocol guy, just as and getting the same runaround as I was getting, and I felt rather bad for him. And finally, I saw that things were going nowhere. So I said to Governor E in Chinese, and I was speaking to Governor E, but my remarks and my comments were really directed to Mr. Protocol.
Mm-hmm.
I said in Chinese, Governor E, next time you're in Washington, please come to my house for dinner. I will cook you a magnificent meal with many courses. I'll serve you fine Israeli wine, and you can have as many seats as you like at the table. And then I just walked away, right? And guess what happened? We got our chair.
Yeah. So my master's degree was in diplomacy. So I love stories like this from actual diplomacy, where you realize so much of it is down to that, making that personal connection, and that so much of it is well, it's just understanding how the other person will react to the situation.
And you know, truth is, Yuval, I'm glad you mentioned it. You know, I talk about my 4 Ps in the book. Kind of the personal touch is one key one. You know, I moved to Washington. I bought a house when I was appointed to the Treasury Department in 2017 because I knew that there were no places to entertain in Washington that could provide a good kosher meal. So I created my own environment so that I could have people like Governor E over. And I must say that I got more of my good work with good results done over my dining room table, over a nice kosher meal with very nice Israeli wine, than I would often be able to achieve in a formal setting across the table in the formal diplomatic meeting room at the Treasury Department. So I spoke a little bit earlier about another P, which is providence, hashgacha pratis, and this is yet another really important P, which is the personal touch, and it comes out in spades in the story with Governor E in the chair.
So my final question is going to be about the CARES Act, which, for anyone who isn't aware, is is it the second stimulus package, I think, for the coronavirus pandemic, and it was the largest in U.S. history.
Yeah.
Could you tell me a little bit about how you worked on that, and maybe if there's some interesting personal stories from there too?
There was one CARES Act. There were 2 extensions of it. One during Trump 45 at the end, and then another one in President Biden, the beginning of President Biden's administration. In all, it was a $2.2 trillion package to begin with. It had tens and tens of programs in it to deal with every different aspect of our economy, to be implemented by many different agencies, of which Treasury was one, and Treasury probably had one of the largest pieces. It's kind of interesting the way that the design and engineering of the act is rather interesting. The pandemic itself was the first time in history that the global markets had been confronted with 2 extraordinarily negatively impactful events. We've had pandemics before, health pandemics, and we've had market instability and market crashes before, but never in history had we had both at the same time. And so this required everybody to pivot, to be nimble, to be agile, to be versatile, and to be wholly focused on the mission of rescuing the economy. And so the president instructed Secretary Mnuchin to go to Capitol Hill, camp out there, and work on the design of the act, which he did with a very small SWAT team from Treasury and a couple of different agencies over a period of 5 days and 5 nights. Specifically relating to the CARES Act, for example, how do you design a program? So our Department of Transportation, like departments of transportation throughout the world, collect data about the airlines and the other entities that they regulate. And through those through that data, we collected information on employees, for example. So we knew roughly how many employees were impacted, uh, or were impacted by the sudden drop of over 90% of air traffic,
Mm-hmm.
and roughly what the wage base was. And so, based on those numbers, the secretary formulated a package that would cover 70% of wages for a period of 9 months, as a kind of look-see to see how things would go and how the pandemic recovery would end up. Following the design and engineering of the broad brush, framework of the act, then those beginning 5 days were followed by another 5 very intensive days of negotiation of the actual language of the bill. And during those 5 days and 5 nights, the secretary and our Treasury team did not leave Capitol Hill. Everybody that was there, camped out there, slept overnight, showered there, ate there until we finished. And at the end of that 10-day period, the secretary brought the bill, the act, ready to sign to the president, and the president signed it. So that was an instance of the secretary being up on the Hill for 10 days and 10 nights and bringing the CARES Act, the bill, to the president to sign. I've always made very, very jokingly and with the highest degree of reverence that Secretary Mnuchin, who is a descendant of the great Hasidic master, the Caduceus Levi, actually beat Moses in bringing the law down by 30 days. And it's just a joke, mind you, for I don't want to offend anybody. But the act required Treasury, specifically relating to the airlines and protecting the 700,000 jobs that were at stake, to implement originally $76 billion of relief that was later extended by another $18 billion on December 26th, through payroll support payments and commercial loans. Mm-hmm. And I was the person who was designated to design and implement that programming. I'm very proud that we, from scratch, literally from scratch, with no people, no infrastructure, no rules, no documentation, no underwriting systems, no payment systems, no audit systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we stood up what became a $94 billion financial institution literally overnight. There were very, very significant and tight deadlines because of the emergency and the exigent circumstances, because lives and jobs were at stake. And so that meant basically working around the clock. And as it turned out, the first major milestone in the act fell out on the first day of Passover. And so I was left with a really great challenge, because I left the office on the eve of Passover, Erev Pesach, knowing that we were under fire from the Hill. There were a number of senators and representatives, particularly from the Democratic side of the aisle, who were really breathing down our backs to ensure that we were going to hit a deadline. They misunderstood the deadline, but they viewed the deadline as the first day of Pesach. We didn't agree. I was very nervous going into the first night of Pesach, so much so that before Pesach started, I consulted with my two main rabbinic leaders, and they both advised me that it was not only permissible, but that I did have to go to the office the next day to check in, and I did, in full regalia, in my bekisher and my hat.
And was this due to the need to save lives?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Save jobs,
which by extension,
I'm not going to speak to the halachic, dimensions of it. Not my area of expertise. That's the guidance that I got. I walked the mile into the building. I got in. I think everybody in my front office was a little bit surprised at the way that I was dressed. It turned out that there were no issues present, and so I turned around and walked home.
Providence again.
Yep.
So my last question, and we'll have to make it fast, is, did you have a previous framework to work on to come up with something like this, or was this something you guys had to just straight up invent or create for yourselves?
We did everything from scratch. Wow. And the point of hashgacha that I point to is that when I was in Asia, and I practiced law there for the better part of 15 years, I worked on the then largest restructuring, financial restructuring in Asia at the time. It was a restructuring of over $6 billion that impacted about 300 companies in 26 different 300 different companies in over 26 countries in the world. And it was a window company of the Guangdong provincial government, which, if it failed, would have meant that there would have been a shock wave that went through the Chinese financial system that would have then reverberated to the global financial system. That's just how large this entity was, and how its contracts and transactions stretched. And that transaction went on for the better part of 2 years. It was grueling, it was hard, it was complex. There were a ton of parties. The documentation demands were extraordinary. We would sometimes be at the table for 2 nights in a row, meaning that it was a lot of stamina, a lot of documents, a lot of organization required. And I believe firmly that if I had not had that transactional experience, which I was able to borrow and extrapolate from, that I may well not have been able to do what I did on the CARES Act. So that's another point of hashgacha that I draw on.
Wow. Well, thank you for being here. And could you just tell the viewers when the book's coming out and where they can get it?
Great. So thank you very much for asking that, Yuval. It's a really important question. The book is going to be released on September 26th. It's available on Amazon and a bunch of the other kind of book e-channels, Barnes and Nobles and whatnot. It's being distributed by Simon & Schuster, so wherever Simon & Schuster books are available, folks should be able to find a copy.
And I want to tell people that I read through this. I'm not an economist, and I understood it. So it's definitely not going to be too difficult for anyone who thinks they won't be able to approach it. Thank you for being here, and this has been so fascinating.
Thank you.